The variations in who finds what gender differences in which personality traits is linked to sample dissimilarities, distinctions in representativeness, and the facet-oriented definition of personalities. Chung and Rensvold explain that variations in research findings, especially for complex research, are based on the methodology, that is, the use of extreme or acquiescence response styles. On the one hand, extreme response style, also called calibration equivalent, uses extreme categories of rating scales. On the other hand, acquiescence response style, or scalar non-equivalence, occurs when one group gives higher or lower responses than another. Grimm and Church argue that while cultural and gender response biases are likely to exist in research, their impact on study outcomes are moderate at best, while the outcomes remain stable over time. Observable sex differences in personality traits could also arise from measurement errors. These errors arise from inconsistencies in filling out personality scales, primarily based on the respondents' levels of education. Social pressures determine how men and women define their personalities. For instance, traits such as fearful or timid could be less desirable for men to endorse compared to women. Thus, observed sex differences could not be an accurate reflection of actual differences in personality traits, but instead, the extent to which individuals are comfortable revealing undesirable personality traits, which differs from one culture to the next. Costa and colleagues argue that in some cultures, self-descriptions are not entirely autonomous, but instead, they are based on group comparisons. For example, a traditional woman is more likely to compare her personality traits, such as kindness or nurturing, to other women as opposed to men. Egalitarian individuals are likely to adopt in-group and out-group comparisons, thereby being able to accurately reveal existing gender differences. Costa and colleagues maintain that compelling traditional respondents to comparing themselves with both sexes would reveal greater differences. The authors also highlight cultural variations in attribution, where similar acts are perceived differently based on whether a society is traditional or egalitarian. Behaviors in traditional societies are easily attributed to roles, while the same behaviors in egalitarian societies are attributed to traits. Williams and colleagues challenged the existence of socially desirability biases by arguing that men's and women's desirability ratings present strong correlations across various cultures. All these variations in research and response to personality tests could account for the differences in which study finds what. That being said, let's examine the actual differences. Buda F. argues that females report higher levels of agreeableness and neuroticism or emotional instability, which account for some of the greatest variations between men and women. These differences highlight male and female variations in dominance-related aggressiveness. Thus, the agreeableness differences between men and women account for the desire to dominate others and the predisposition to callously exploit them. The sex differences reported on extraversion or boldness are tied to evolutionary foundations. The evolutionary underpinnings of dominance-related behavior do not relate to conscious willingness and aggressiveness that explain social dominance. Human males, just like in the animal kingdom, are larger, more aggressive, risk-prone, and more likely to engage in dominance contests. Social dominance goes beyond basic aggressiveness to include emotional stability, especially stress resilience, which is required for the maintenance of high status for a prolonged period of time. Aggressiveness, neuroticism, anxiety and dominance tendencies have high heritability, an indication that the traits have adaptive functions. Buda F. explains that combination of hostility and emotional stability manifest in primary sociopathy, that is, people who are cold and detached, with the resulting personality trait being Machiavellianism, which is characterized by deceit in interpersonal relationships, a cynical view of the human nature, and the lack of morality. High scores of hostility and low emotional stability result in secondary psychopathy, characterized by antisocial behavior that does not contain deceit and social emotions and high levels of guilt, shame, and anxiety. Sociopathy is more common in males than in females, with primary sociopathy being associated with dominant behavior, propensity to control others, the craving for power, and the need to achieve high priority in accessing valuable resources, while secondary sociopathy is linked to submissive behavior. Dominance in the context of relationships arises from stress manipulation in contests, with the winner being the one who outstresses the other. Buddha F correlates hormone levels with aggressiveness, dominance, antisocial behavior, social challenge responses, and stress resistance. The findings by Buddha F are supported by Chapman and colleagues, who note that college and adult women score higher than men in the agreeableness and neuroticism personality traits. Neuroticism reflects proneness to a wide range of negative emotions, while agreeableness highlights compliance, amicability, trust, and altruism. Chapman and colleagues argue that gender differences in openness to experience or interest in novelty and extroversion of excitement seeking are inconsistent or negligible. For instance, men score higher in some openness facets, such as openness to ideas or intellectual interests. Women score higher in other openness facets, including openness to aesthetics or aesthetic interest and feelings. Costa and colleagues' publication of 1984 reported that the openness differences between the sexes explain men's choice of information-oriented occupations, while women choose aesthetic-oriented occupations. Men have higher excitement-seeking scores while women score higher in warmth in the context of extroversion. Men and women differ minimally in the context of conscientiousness. The neurotic differences between men and women are associated with the social acceptance of women expressing negative emotions and the gender-specific transition from being mothers to grandmothers. Women's agreeableness nature is linked to their nurturing biological underpinnings and social presentations. Women's agreeableness is supported by Lipper, who suggests that women are more agreeable and neurotic than men, which are the personality traits that presented the greatest sex differences, with women scoring higher than men in all the other traits, that is, openness, conscientiousness, and extroversion, despite that the differences are negligible. Schmidt and colleagues' study of 2008 revealed that women reported higher levels of conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism across the 55 sampled countries. Men report greater openness and excitement-seeking. The authors list human development, that is economic wealth, education, access to knowledge, and healthy life, as the main predictors of larger sex differences in personality. Changes in men's personality traits presented the primary cause of sex-based personality variations across different cultures. The flexibility or fluidity of men's and women's personality traits in developed nations is central to sexual dysmorphism. Schmidt and colleagues associate egalitarianism with greater personality differences between men and women through the finding that France and Netherlands presented the largest gender differences, with these differences being smaller in India and Botswana. Various other studies support the gender equality paradox, which suggests that the more egalitarian a society becomes, the greater the personality differences between the sexes. For instance, Schmidt and colleagues' study of 2016 uncovered that men report lower levels of neuroticism, agreeableness, and some extroversion facets such as warmth, and openness, such as feelings. The authors maintain that the expectation of gender differences reducing with the prevalence of egalitarianism in a society is based on the predictions of the social role theory. However, the gender differences in multiple aspects of personality, including values, depression, subjective well-being, self-esteem, dark triad traits, and the Big Five personality traits, are greater in societies with more equal gender roles and socialization. The increase in gender differences with egalitarianism are not restricted to personality traits, but also physical features, including height, blood pressure, and athleticism for sport persons in cultures that have embraced egalitarianism. Thus, evolutionary or biological theories are presented as more useful, compared to social theories, in explaining the gender differences between the sexes. Lipper observes that personality differences between men and women are influenced by time, culture, social environment, and gender, which remain stable over time despite biological and cultural influences. In terms of the ocean model, Lipper argues that agreeableness and neuroticism in women present the largest gender differences, while women registered minimally higher scores than men in openness, extroversion, and conscientiousness. Despite the small differences for the listed traits, there are greater facet-related personality differences. For instance, women score higher in positive emotions and warmth facets of extroversion, while men score higher in excitement-seeking, assertiveness, and dominance. Men also score higher in aggressiveness, while women are higher in harm avoidance, self-control, stress reaction or anxiety, and sociability. Lipper maintains that sex differences in personality traits influence the choice of interests, with men choosing things-related professions such as engineering and carpentry, while women tend to lean towards people-oriented professions, including nursing, counseling, and teaching. The author argues that the gender differences in personality and choice of occupation are greater in egalitarian compared to traditional societies, thereby contradicting the social role theory while supporting the evolutionary, attributional, and social comparison theories. The support for the evolutionary account of the gender differences between the sexes is supported by the fact that interest variations are consistent across cultures and time. Lipper's findings are replicated by Costa and colleagues, who note that women report higher neuroticism, agreeableness, warmth, and openness to feelings, while men are more assertive and open to ideas. Some of the neurotic components include anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. These components lead to a number of disorders, including anxiety disorder, panic disorder with or without agoraphobia, phobias, major depression, dysmorphic disorder, and borderline personality disorder that are more commonly diagnosed in women than in men, as documented by Costa and colleagues. Men are more assertive and less anxious than women, while women score higher in nurturance and trust. Women report higher levels of anger, while men are more likely to report hostility. The high neurotic nature of women is associated with greater sensitivity. Extroversion is often presented as a combination of love and dominance, while agreeableness combines love and submission. Thus, women are more likely to score higher in agreeableness, but the relationship between gender and extroversion is deemed as complex, with men being more assertive and women being warm. Costa and colleagues argue that when it comes to openness, men are guided by reason while women are guided by emotion. Therefore, men are open to ideas or intellectually oriented, while women are open to aesthetics and feelings. Greater emotional facial expression and the ability to decode non-verbal communication is more common among adult females compared to adult males. Costa and colleagues argue that these personality differences are consistent with age, culture, and gender stereotypes. In other words, gender differences are modest in magnitude, consistent with gender stereotypes, and replicable across cultures, thereby providing evidence for the evolutionary account of the gender differences between men and women. Crampon and colleagues confirm the presence of sex differences in spatial thinking, domain-specific self-concepts of own competence, general and domain-specific aspects of anxiety, different aspects of aggressiveness, neuroticism, psychosomatic complaints, powerful others' externality and generalized control orientations, and Machiavellianism. Noteworthy, men score higher in spatial thinking, while women registered greater anxiety scores across various domains, including test situations, socialization, and physical injury. Females register higher verbal fluency scores, indicative of an edge in crystallized intelligence, while males score higher in spatial thinking or fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence focuses on the ability to utilize knowledge gathered from personal experience, while fluid intelligence refers to the ability to reason and solve problems in unique and new situations. Females are less aggressive and more anxious or neurotic than males. Females are more external in the context of reinforcing locus control. Men report higher Machiavellianism or manipulativeness scores, and men are more likely to report risk-taking behavior because women express greater fear of failure. This phenomenon could account for the gender differences in the pursuit of entrepreneurship and leadership opportunities, because risk-taking is fundamental in the success of both. Ramani and Lavasani observed that girls report higher agreeableness and openness scores, while boys score higher in thrill or sensation-seeking, disinhibition, and susceptibility to boredom. The authors posit that sensation-seeking presents cultural and racial differences, with Western cultures and white people presenting higher scores than all the others. The evolutionary component of female agreeableness is presented as an adaptive factor in offspring reproduction and preservation, while it is socially associated with the female gender. Sensation-seeking gender differences are mostly associated with genetic, biological, physiological, psychological, and social factors. For instance, minimal supervision of boys from a young age allows them to be adventurous, thereby being more likely to engage in risky behaviors as adults. Also, men's physicality and testosterone levels influence the engagement in risky behaviors at rates higher than women. Men report higher self-esteem and assertiveness, while women score higher in extroversion, anxiety, trust, and especially, tender-mindedness, for example, nurturance. Ramani and Lavasani account for the contribution of gender stereotypes to personality differences, with women being more likely to report themselves as neurotic, warm, agreeable, and open to feelings, while men report being assertive and open to ideas. The authors maintain that the research on extroversion and conscientiousness is conflicting, with some finding women scoring higher and others finding the vice versa to be true. Some researchers maintain that gender differences in some personalities are inconclusive, while others focus on personality-specific facets. Overall, Ramani and Lavasani observe that gendered personality differences are greater in prosperous egalitarian Western cultures with equal opportunities because personality traits are less constrained, thereby being able to diverge more freely. Lynn and Martin suggest that women reported higher levels of neuroticism in all the 37 sampled countries. Men reported higher psychoticism than women except in France, with Nigeria and Uganda reporting similar psychoticism levels between men and women, and men reported higher levels of extroversion than women in 30 of the 37 countries. Hyde observes gender differences in motor behaviors and sexuality and moderate differences in aggression. The author explains that on the one hand, moderate to large sex differences exist in attitudes towards casual sex and sexual behaviors such as masturbation, interests in people versus things, physical aggression, sensation-seeking, and agreeableness. On the other hand, self-esteem, reward sensitivity, gregariousness, conscientiousness, and negative affectivity present small but consistent gender differences. Ismachelina and Voronin argue that openness, neuroticism, and extroversion are the only personality traits associated with non-verbal intelligence. The authors maintain that women report higher levels of agreeableness, neuroticism, men report greater levels of sensation-seeking, intelligence, while openness and conscientiousness, that is, organization, dedication, self-discipline, and competence, do not present significant gender differences. Conscientious boys and girls are open and extroverted, as well as less anxious, impulsive, and hostile. The correlation between openness and intelligence is only present among females. Johnson and Wissman note that women register higher levels of rumination or consistently having dark and sad thoughts, brooding or being moody, and reflection. The authors maintain that starting from adolescence, women are twice as likely to be depressed as men, with the psychological explanation being the fact that women ruminate more on their depressive symptoms compared to men. Rumination subsequently interferes with problem-solving, instrumental behavior, and social support, due to major depressive symptoms. The gender differences in rumination increase as individuals age. Adolescence, also called storm and stress, is characterized by tremendous development-related changes in both boys and girls. These changes are biological, psychosocial, and physical, as well as familial and academic. The dramatic changes are stressful and as such, require adolescents to be resilient, that is, be able to bounce back, to maintain stable relationships and consistent psychological functioning. Imura and Taku observe that resilience protects adolescents from the high risk arising from the transition into adulthood. The authors explain that adolescent Japanese girls are more likely to be conscientious, which is also similar for adults, but all the other personality traits do not present significant differences. The authors associate conscientious differences in favor of women with the evolutionary predisposition to maintaining positive interpersonal relationships. The lack of differences in the other personality traits is attributed to their social as opposed to biological bases. The positive relationship between openness and extroversion influence resilience in men, while neuroticism affects resilience in women. Vaniello and colleagues note that women report higher levels of explicit neuroticism, extroversion, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. Implicitly higher neuroticism and agreeableness scores are reported in women, while men register higher levels of implicit extroversion and openness. The largest difference between implicit and explicit measures was on extroversion, with women registering stronger observable extroversion and men strongly identifying with implicit extroversion. Personality sex distributions differ by 8% when considering implicit measures, and 25% in the context of explicit measures. Weisberg and colleagues replicate most of the gender differences documented in this video, with women reporting higher neuroticism, agreeableness and extroversion than men. The authors argue that there are greater gender differences at some personality facet or aspect levels, as in the case of conscientiousness, openness and extroversion. The sex differences in these personalities diverge at the facet level, thereby being smaller or negligible at the Big Five level. Traits are consistent patterns of behaviors, motives, feelings, and thoughts that are accompanied by the respective psychological states. Most of the reported differences between men and women are based on which gender averages higher scores than the other. For instance, women being agreeable arises from being more nurturing, altruistic, and tender-minded. Men could also be agreeable, some men more than some women, but most women register higher agreeableness scores than most men. Average gender differences do not suggest that the sexes are at the opposite ends of the spectrum, but instead, they acknowledge the differences that exist alongside the relevant overlaps. Thus, personality research could focus on the Big Five or the specific facets. The choice of facets to associate with a personality trait is guided by a review of psychological constructs or systematic sampling. Weisberg and colleagues label the facets as volatility and withdrawal for neuroticism, enthusiasm and assertiveness for extroversion, intellect and openness for openness/intellect, industriousness and orderliness for conscientiousness, and compassion and politeness for agreeableness. Aspect or facet-level investigations are important owing to the unclear and inconclusive nature of the personality differences. Women score higher in neuroticism, the related facets of volatility and withdrawal but not anger or hostility, and other aspects outside the Big Five including lower self-esteem. Women also score higher in agreeableness and its facets, including compassion, politeness, compliance, and cooperation as noted before. Women's agreeableness is associated with their interdependence nature while men are independent. Agreeable differences are larger among older adults and among whites. Women register higher scores in some conscientiousness or personal organization facets, such as self-discipline, dutifulness, and order, but the differences are not significant. Neuroticism is associated with orderliness owing to the relationship between perfectionism and anxiety. Women's orderliness declines with age, while it increases with men's age as they become more industrious. As mentioned before, women score averagely higher on extroversion, as well as the facets of positive emotions, gregariousness or sociability, and warmth, while men score higher in excitement-seeking, assertiveness, agency, and dominance. The findings on extroversion depend on the proximity of tested facets to social dominance. Again, as mentioned before, openness at the personality level does not present notable gender differences, but it does at the facet level, with women being open to feelings and aesthetics and men being open to ideas or intellect.